I know it says doctor on the invitation. I'm a doctor in the sense that Dr. Heath is a doctor, which is to say I have a PhD. If there's a medical emergency, don't look at me. Thanks very much. Coming to these kinds of events and being able to talk with people who care passionately about their city is really one of the great pleasures of my life and certainly of my career. Very honored to be here, very excited by the turnout. Always a delight to see that people care about their city and want to make it better. It's often common to start with a joke. I'm actually going to start with the tough love. The amount, if that's on the left, that's 100 people and their cars. And on the right, that's 100 people and then what they look like on bicycles. And in the middle is 100 people and what they're like on a bus. And the point is how much space that takes. One of the things I'm known for is not being as interested in statistics as the average pundit. I am not going to recite any statistics in this entire presentation. Instead, I'm going to appeal to your own understanding about how reality works, okay? This is geometry. This is even more powerful than lots of data about human preferences. Because the power of this is precisely that nobody cares what you think about it. This is not going to change in response to anyone's opinion. It is not going to change if we do focus groups on whether people like the fact that more people fit on a bus than fit in cars. Nobody cares about that. That's how you know this is a fact about the universe. And we are trained so much, and understandably, to spend so much of our focus now on making sure we understand lots of human perspectives, which is very important during actual planning. But it's also important to understand that we exist in space and time, and there are some facts about that. Because this ends up being, ultimately, one of the most irrefutable arguments for public transit. There are lots of other great arguments for public transit that get us into cultural questions and so on, but nobody can argue with this one. If you're going to build a relatively dense city, what is a city? A city is lots of people living close together. What does that mean? That means there's not much space per person. So the way of getting around on the left, which involves taking a lot of space per person, mathematically isn't going to work because big things don't fit in small spaces. Okay? And that is not a liberal idea or a conservative idea. That is how reality works. So much of the ultimate case for public transit is here. I'm not going to talk about driverless cars unless someone asks the question, but on the left is both what the world looks like before driverless cars and what the world looks like after driverless cars. I want to talk more about the North American transit conversation because as many of you who follow it probably know, it's a very confused conversation, and I do my little what I can do over on the edge to try to make it a little clearer. One of the basic challenges of the North American conversation is that most of the people who are talking about transit, including most of the people many of the people who are influencing transit decisions, are looking at transit from the outside. And I want to talk a little bit more about what it means to look at transit from the inside. I don't just mean literally that they're looking at the outside of the bus more than they look at the inside, although that's true also, or that they often care more about how a service looks than how it functions, although that's something we deal with also. I just mean more fundamentally that most of the people in our society are motorists, and you're going to bring a whole bunch of unconscious assumptions just from being a motorist that you'll have to consciously notice and let go of if you're really going to do great transit planning. What does transit look like from the inside? This is a simple new tool. Folks in the real estate industry may already know about it from other modes, where I can plop down my pointer. This is my hometown, Portland, Oregon. It's actually relevant to me right now because I'm in the process of finding new office space, and I can plunk this pointer down in downtown, and it'll tell me on transit plus walking, where could I get to in 15, 30, or 45 minutes? That's the blue, the green, and the pink. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or 45 minutes. Now, one of the cool things I want you to notice right away is that when we say, where can we be soon? Yes, I know the internet is wonderful, and we can do all kinds of things on the internet now, but we've had 20 years of the internet being about to abolish geography, remember? And abolish commuting. It's not happening. Human beings still need to see each other and be in each other's presence. So I'm going to argue that where I can be soon is basically what can I do? What opportunities can I access? In other words, I'm going to argue that this is, in a very real and practical sense, a map of your freedom. Because you can't hold a job that isn't in those blobs. You're not going to meet and make friends with or date or marry someone who isn't in those blobs. You exist because your parents were in the same blob, okay? It all comes down to that. Access, being able to get places, feeling that your city is available to you. Because if it isn't, you might as well live in a small town. Now, the other thing about freedom is that it comes with personal responsibility. So as I think about where to locate my office, I can think I could spend more on an office downtown and my employees would be able to get to me from that area, or I could locate in a kind of inner city hipster district like maybe a couple miles out Euclid and they'd be able to get to me from that area, or I could choose a business park in a suburban cul-de-sac and people on transit and walking would be able to get to me from that area, and I get to choose, but I am choosing this reality when I choose my location. You're free to choose your location, but there's also personal responsibility about that. But the other powerful thing about this image is that it raises the question, what if the purpose of our transit planning were to grow these blobs for people? What if we wanted people to be able to get to more places more quickly so that they had more freedom and opportunity in their lives? What if we were in the freedom business? Growing these blobs, making them bigger for people, would really be a very concrete way of measuring that. I mean, of course, not just the area, but the amount of stuff in these blobs. But really what I'm talking about then is how much of the city in all its richness is available to me, which is very close to saying, how free am I? So abundant access, the term that I use for this, means as many people as possible able to reach as many destinations possible as quickly as possible. But if I stopped there, I would sound like a transportation geek. I would sound like an engineer going on about travel time. No, this isn't the point. The point is this: so that they have as many real choices and opportunities in their lives as possible and are therefore free, as we understand that term. That's what I mean by abundant access, and that's what is actually at stake. Now, the work of enlarging those blobs is the result of some geometric relationships between frequency, span, connections, speed, reliability. I'm not going to go into the math right now. I talk you through it in a very friendly terms without a single equation in my book. But I want to hit, and again, this is geometry, which means it's true on other planets. If you have a science fiction bent, go Google an article of mine called How Universal is Transit Geometry. I do a little thought experiment there. How little do I have to assume about an alien civilization on another planet in order to conclude that they have public transit and that the relationship between frequency, span, connection, speed, reliability is exactly what it is here, and that therefore they are probably having a number of the same conversations that we're having here? You can do a lot of that with geometry, and remarkably few assumptions about whether these aliens, hop, slither, drift, however it is that they actually get around. But I want to talk for a second about frequency. Because I warned you, if you're coming at this as a motorist, there are things you're going to tend not to get, and this is the biggest one. Sometimes I'll hear business leaders say, I've been working in Iceland recently, and there were some business leaders who came through from some terribly important place and said, well, you're just not going to get business travelers if your downtown, if your city is more than 20 minutes by train from the airport. There's a problem for Reykjavik because the airport is 40 miles from the city, so they will have to go really fast. But the funny thing about that is that assumption that it's the in-vehicle travel time that determines when you get there. That's a motorist's error. That's a false analogy from driving a car, isn't it? Because in transit, it's not just that, it's also the weight, and the weight is governed by frequency. Frequency is such an overwhelming determinant of the usefulness of transit, and yet it is invisible to the average motorist and the average policymaker who's thinking like a motorist quite unconsciously, usually with the best of intentions. And so one of the things I figured out, and I started beating this drum about 10 years ago, is that transit agencies have to scream about frequency because otherwise people aren't going to see it. And so for the last 10 years, I've been working with lots of cities, and we've been starting to spread this notion that a good transit system gives you a map in which the high-frequency network jumps right out at you, because that's the network that you can use if you're not somebody who is able to wait a long time. And that's a very clear category of lots of people who have an openness to transit, but who aren't going to wait half an hour. So this is a very important way to help people see the very useful layer of often your bus system, as distinct from the incredible complexity that you get when you just draw all the bus routes on top of each other. Let me give you a concrete example. Every time I draw a map for a client of a transit system, the first things I do as a transit planner, I draw their network for them so they can see it in a different way. This is Houston, and I always draw maps like this. High-frequency service that's coming every 15 minutes or better. Service that is always coming soon is in red. It is meant to jump right out at you. 30-minute service is in blue. Hourly service, which is a great way to get low ridership out of absolutely any land use pattern, a bus only once an hour, is shown in green. And I want to show you now the before and after of a huge network change which did not add any operating cost. Before, after. Before, after. Before, after. How on earth did we do that? How on earth did we draw that many red lines without any more operating cost? Well, a lot of other little stuff disappeared. So this is one of the really hard things about redesigning a network, is if you're redesigning a network at no cost, and especially if you want higher ridership, and don't let that just be a bean countery thing. Higher ridership means you're liberating more people's lives. Right? It's a good thing. It's a social thing. It's not just an economist or bean counters thing. What you have to do is run fewer empty buses and more full buses. And so so one of the things you'll notice is that there are a lot fewer green lines there than here, because green lines, hourly buses, are always empty. Nearly empty. There are 2 or 3 people on them, and the 2 or 3 people on them really appreciate them, but it is not an efficient way to provide transportation to those 2 or 3 people. And the red lines are following patterns of density, walkability, linearity. We can talk more about those sort of necessary features, but density is the overwhelming one. The other thing I want you to notice is that the red lines intentionally form a grid shape. We are starting to create with high-frequency service the kind of easy-to-navigate network that everybody is used to having in their cars, especially if you live in a gridded city. You can go up this street and then you can turn left or turn right. Anywhere on that red network, transferring is so easy because the next bus is coming soon that it's easy to go anywhere. And the reason this is going to grow ridership is because it enlarges so many people's blobs, is fundamentally what this comes down to. That network forced everyone, if you wanted to get around at high frequency, you had to go downtown to go anywhere else. Now you have a network that connects a huge share of the city by a reasonably direct path, usually an L-shaped path, up or over, down and over, which is exactly the way you would drive. So this is the kind of thing that I like to work on, because we are massively expanding actual, useful, measurable freedom for people. And when we hear a lot that it's about ridership prediction and that ridership is the outcome, yes, it is, but let's never forget that access, as in liberty, has its own value and is a thing that a lot of people care about. Liberty is not measured by what you did, it's measured by all the things you could have done, right? And so that feeling of personal liberty or opportunity is something that is important, independent of what people actually did. When I'm in a blue state and I'm talking to people in the planning world, they're going on about this triple bottom line, right? Things have to work economically, they have to work environmentally, and they have to work socially. But all 3 of those, I'm going to sound like a conservative here for a moment, but I really don't care whether it sounds liberal or conservative. All 3 of those are the results of a fundamentally managed society. And there is a 4th important thing that is missing, which is the deeply personal sensation of liberty and opportunity. And that personal sensation is not interested in the statistics that arise from your actual behavior. It lies in the very fact that you had choices about how to behave. And that's what I'm talking about here. So what's wrong with transit and what's wrong with our transit conversations is the way we chop the topic apart. You may remember, some of you may remember the time when a past president said, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." That's called a binarism or dualism. It's a way of chopping the world apart and saying everything is either on this side of the line or that side of the line, and this is the line that matters. One of the basic ways that political demagoguery works is that it draws that line without making clear that it's drawn that line, and so that people get unconsciously sucked into that binarism. So I'll give you a very simple example. I'm known for having said some skeptical things about certain rail projects in America. I'm known for being somebody who keeps pointing out the utility of bus services and the importance of bus services. And lots of people will say, have written, well, Jarrett is anti-rail and pro-bus. No, I am opposed to slicing transit into trains and buses. I am opposed to the idea that that is a good way to divide up the topic. Because when you chop a topic apart, you get to see things more closely, but you've also missed things, because there are other ways of chopping a topic that will reveal other things. I just want to talk about two of the big problematic binarisms that we face. One is rail versus buses, which I've already touched on. The other is this notion of a choice rider. If you want the maximum possible freedom, you need to quit caring whether you're on rails or tires. This is obvious if you think about it. This is your freedom if you don't care whether you're on rails or tires. This tool has a box you can check that says, "I only ride rails." Okay, it'll give you smaller blobs. You can go fewer places, you have less liberty if you only ride trains, right? Simple enough. So the question is not, do you like riding trains more than buses? The question is your preference for trains more important than your desire for liberty? That's the actual context in which that question arises. Then there's this issue about how transit generates permanence. I hope there are some people from the real estate and development communities in the room. If not, I'm sure there are people who love them. I love them too. But they have this tendency to make a tragic simplification about how transit works. Real estate, obviously, needs to create the appearance of, ideally the reality of, enduring land value, enduring value of a particular site or location. And the tragic simplification is that infrastructure, particularly rails, generates permanence. You see those rails on the street, they're not going away. It's permanent, right? Whereas a bus route could always be changed. Almost everybody in the real estate and development communities has heard this line, has repeated this line, believes this line, and it is wrong. Because here's how permanence actually works. In actual transit, you build infrastructure so that you can run service. Infrastructure without service is rails in the street, but a car never comes, right? Service is you're paying drivers to go back and forth. Service is, in the long run, more expensive than infrastructure because it is an eternal cost rather than a one-time cost. Think about if you come from the world of roads or you come from the world of buildings, those don't work that way. Those are, you pay a huge cost up front and then it's relatively cheap to use. But transit's not that way. Transit is, the big cost is in operating. So the service leads to access, the size of your blobs. That access generates ridership, and that ridership generates permanence. Because true permanence in transit arises from the fact that a transit system is justifying its operating cost, not its capital cost. You have to justify those eternal operations. And so when people say a bus route could always be changed, well, yes, but what we did in Houston was to replace a lot of ephemeral, weak, and therefore quite possibly impermanent bus routes with a structure whose ridership is going to be so much higher that you can expect it to be more permanent. True permanence lies in ridership, not in infrastructure. And then there's this issue of choice riders. Who doesn't want to be transit to be just for them? Most of the people who come out and testify about transit want transit to be better for them, even if it makes it worse for someone else. And in this increasingly atomized society where we spend more and more time listening only to people who agree with us, this is becoming a real issue. Because transit thrives on diversity. If you have gone and ridden some of the most highest ridership, most productive transit systems in the world, like the New York City subways or the subways of Europe, you will notice the incredible diversity of people sharing the car with you. I don't just mean ethnic diversity, I mean diversity of economic position. The billionaire sits next to the guy who washes dishes in his favorite restaurant. And they do that because the service is just so fantastically useful for both of them. that diversity arises from the usefulness, the focus on usefulness. And so every time we bring our expectations of specialization and separateness, every time we want a bus for these people and then a different bus for those people, we are in opposition to the fundamental math of how transit succeeds. So we really have to challenge this binary thinking. It's not just that we have this flattering term for most of ourselves, the choice rider. Here's this guy who, he owns his car, he likes driving his car, he's happy in his car, and I'm being told I'm supposed to make him get out of his Lexus and ride a bus. And then on the other end, there's this dependent rider, and you know what? When transportation professionals get together and they think you aren't listening, they use an even worse word for these people. They call them captive riders. Captive, like we have them in the dungeon. Captive riders. And this binarism should remind you of the way we construct class, right? This notion that it's not that we're all along a spectrum of income, it's that we're in these boxes with big walls in between. Right? Everybody's either a choice rider like the guy in the Lexus or the captive or dependent rider. No, we're all in the middle, and it is a spectrum rather than a pair of boxes. One of the basic ways to get out of binary thinking is to remember that we're talking about a spectrum rather than a pair of boxes. Think about all the things that we have been used to dividing into pairs of boxes, which are actually spectrums. Probably the very last one is gender, and now even that one is starting to look like a spectrum, right? Everybody is in a different situation with different options, and that is why I can make a little incremental improvement to a transit system. We're not deploying lots of trains in Houston, we're just rearranging how the buses run. And I can materially change the usefulness for transit for enough people that in their situation, it starts to make sense for them. I move them across the line. But if we're carrying around that binary model of everyone's choice or captive, that model doesn't explain the reality. It doesn't explain that I can make a little change and get an incremental benefit. And so when people tell me, you've got to be focused on the choice riders, they're really talking about wealthy people, the guy with the Lexus. And I have to say, excuse me, congratulations on your wealth. I'm sure you've worked hard for it. I'm not questioning your right to it. But if you're wealthy, there aren't very many of you. And transit is about large numbers of people. And if we design a transit system exclusively around your tastes, we're not going to have very many riders because there aren't very many people with your tastes. Or to put it another way, there aren't very many people who make the trade-off at that particular point, who decide to use transit or not based on whether they serve nice coffee or something. That's not where most people are making that decision. We just had a spectacular fiasco in Toronto with an extremely expensive elite train between the airport and downtown that only makes 2 stops in between and that most actual Toronto residents therefore can't get to. And that charged, $25 for a one-way trip, and it's empty. That is a classic result of very fortunate people getting in a room by themselves and designing something that would work for them and forgetting how unusual they are. If you're wealthy, you're unusual, and that means your personal tastes are not a good guide to how most people will make decisions. I can't emphasize that too strongly, and I have wealthy friends, I love wealthy people, but it's just an occupational hazard about being wealthy. Tell your planners to separate different classes of people, and everybody's blobs get smaller. That's the basic math. It's only when we get everybody on the same vehicle that everybody's blobs can be larger and people can actually get to as many places as possible. So I'm going to end on this because it really brings us back to the kinds of things that it makes sense to be talking about in a religious context. We've all had this experience. Maybe some of us have been these people. I have been these people. But we've probably all had the experience of driving down a street and seeing someone waiting at a stop that you wouldn't be willing to wait at, for a vehicle that you might not be willing to ride, in a situation that looks miserable and sad to you. And what are we supposed to feel about that? The pastor and I were talking about this last night. The New Testament will just not let go of this issue. It just comes up over and over and over in religious scripture because it is one of the great human problems. How are fortunate people supposed to feel in the presence of less fortunate people? Because, by the way, one of the things about cities is that you won't be able to avoid this experience. And one of the great things that suburban and car-based development is designed to do is to help you avoid that experience. In cities, no hope. You're going to have this experience. So what do we think about that? Well, when I look at those kinds of transit riders, I think, well, they're using transit before anyone else will, And they really know it from the inside. They have an understanding of it that most more fortunate people who are motorists don't have yet. Well, actually a good term for that is early adopter. And another word for it is pioneer. Out in Oregon, where we have a pioneer narrative about how we came to be there, we have this story about the people who came out in covered wagons and, winched their covered wagons down the incredible slopes of the Cascades and the Rockies to get to where we are. They came to Oregon with incredible difficulty so that later on we would have roads and trains to go to Oregon with, so that it would be much easier for us later. And I suggest that the low-income rider is pioneering your transit system in exactly that sense. It is because they are willing to use it before it's necessarily good enough for you to use it that there is something to build on and something to grow from and a reason to continue growing the system. And every time we try to approach this from a spectrum of class, we chop off exactly that opportunity. We reject their leadership, in effect. So why is transit so hard? Transit is hard because in this society, winning usually means that somebody else is losing. That is how sports works, that is how war works, that is how elections work. And that is how a lot of business works, although not all of it. When business really is succeeding, it's creating a larger pie instead of just competitors fighting over the pie in a winner-loser model. And we have all those expectations. You've probably even heard politicians and elected officials who like to use the word loser, which is their way of signaling to you that they can only see the world in those terms, that they can't imagine a form of winning that doesn't require someone else to be losing. And so the difficulty of wrapping our heads around transit is precisely that transit is a win-win. I'll go brief a city councilor. I'll go brief, I'll be brought in to brief, some important person, and I'll start to explain how this works, and they'll say, no, just tell me who the winners and losers are. And I can't help them, because there aren't any losers. In the big scheme, transit is always a win-win. But you have to be able to accept that that is actually a valid form of winning. So thanks very much.